In the last lecture, we talked a little bit about the continuity, the diversity, and the unity of biology. And we also talked about the different scopes that you can study biology in, whether it's the big picture looking at ecosystems, or it's, the very submicroscopic picture of looking at the atoms and molecules that make up the cells of the organisms and stuff. So in our adventure of biology this semester, we are going to actually start small and then go big. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the atoms and molecules that make up cells, which make up tissues, which make up organisms, which make up populations, which are in communities and ecosystems. So we're going to start small and go big. So to start off with, we're going to start with some just random facts, like your body is made up of 65% oxygen atoms. Now, obviously, they're not, pure oxygen atoms, otherwise you'd be vaporous like ghosts wandering around the town. These oxygen atoms are combined with other atoms to make a plethora of different kinds of molecules, some very small, some very large. And all of these molecules are going to contribute to your cells in some way or another, and all of those cells together make you. So what we're going to do is take a look at these atoms and molecules that make up you. So we begin our lecture with matter, which is anything that occupies space and has mass. So matter not only makes up you, it makes up the world, it makes up the universe, the stars, everything. Remember, there's 3 physical states to matter, like you learned all the way back in elementary school: solid, liquid, gas. And depending on temperature and pressure, you can have, every single element compound have, one of these be in one of these physical states, depending on, like I said, the temperature or pressure of the environment. Like you learned in chemistry, elements make up matter. Remember, elements are the substances that can't be broken down into further substances that have that characteristic of the elements. And there's 92 naturally occurring elements, and there's a bunch more discovered every year that are man-made. Out of those 92, though, about a quarter of them, about 25, are actually essential for life. The other 75% don't really matter to life. Now, if we take a look at the human body, of those 25 elements that are essential for life, there's 4 biggies that make up 96% of the human body. And those 4 biggies are carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. So that makes up 96%. And then if you take a look over here, these other 7 make up the other 3.9%. So there's only basically 11 elements that make up your entire body, okay, or at least make up 99.9% of everything that your body does and is made of. So it's kind of amazing that we're basically just made up of 11 different elements. If we take 2 or more elements and we put them together in a fixed ratio, we're going to get what's called compounds. And a fixed ratio just means, like, for example, water is made of H2O. So every water molecule is made up of 2 H's and 1 O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. Same thing with sodium chloride, or table salt. It's always 1 sodium, 1 chlorine. Okay, so it's a fixed ratio. You're never going to find Na2Cl in a crystal of salt. So that's what a fixed ratio is. Now, compounds are always going to be more common. We're going to find them more often than in pure elements. So basically what that means is that elements like to be buddied up with somebody to make a compound. So we can have compounds that are really simple, like water, like I mentioned before, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atoms. We can also have very, very, very complex compounds like DNA that are made up of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and phosphorus, so those 5, but they are arranged in such a diverse way that it makes up this hugely complex molecule that can even store data and is basically responsible for life. So those are compounds. If we take a look at compounds and we break them down into the elements in which they're made of, and we take a further look at those elements, we're going to see that they are made up of atoms. And remember, atoms have three major parts: protons, neutrons, and electrons. The protons are found in the nucleus and have a positive charge. The neutrons are also found in the nucleus, and they have a neutral charge. Remember, the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus are going to make up the mass of an atom. Now on the outside, we have the third part of the atom, which is the electron, and it has a negative charge to balance out the protons that have a positive charge. So overall, atoms will be electrically neutral. Now, as we said before, there's 92 different naturally occurring elements. So what makes them different from each other is the number of subatomic particles that make them up. So if we take a look at the number of protons in the nucleus, that's what we call the atomic number. And that's going to give the element its identity. So if we take a look at these examples below, hydrogen atoms will always have an atomic number of 1, meaning it always has 1 proton. And so that's basically what hydrogen means. Hydrogen has 1 proton. All carbon atoms are going to have an atomic number of 6. They have 6 protons, and that's what makes them a carbon atom. Same with nitrogen. Nitrogen atoms will always have 7 protons, and oxygen atoms will always have 8 protons. So the atomic number is going to give the identity of the atom. Now, if you remember in the previous slide, I said that the protons and the neutrons in the nucleus make up the mass of the atom. So that means that's what we call mass number. Okay, so how heavy that atom is. And we can imagine that as we increase atomic numbers, increase the number of protons that are in the elements, we're also going to increase the number of neutrons in the elements, and you're going to get heavier and heavier atoms. So as we go down and across the periodic table, those elements are going to get heavier and heavier and bigger and bigger. Now remember, on the outside of the atom, we've got the electrons, okay, and they'll always be equal to the number of protons, and that's what's going to make the atom electrically neutral. So a hydrogen atom will have 1 electron to balance out the 1 proton. Same thing with the nitrogen atom. The nitrogen atom has 7 protons. It's going to have 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons, okay, to balance it out so that it is a neutral atom. Now, if it was only as simple as that, that would be awesome, but it's not. Atoms are hugely complicated, and one way that they're complicated is that we can have different forms of the same element, okay, and so that's what we call isotopes, if you remember that word from chemistry. Basically, you have the same number of protons and electrons, but you have a different number of neutrons. So there's a different number of neutrons inside the nucleus. But remember, the neutrons don't give the identity. So it's not a different type of atom. It'll still be, a carbon atom because it's got 6 protons. It just might have 8 neutrons instead of 6, okay? And that, just makes it kind of a different kind. I've once was taught that isotopes are like different models of cars. So you know how you can get like a Honda Accord, EX, and you can get a Honda Accord LX, and then you can get, a Honda Accord like, Elite Edition or whatever. So those different kinds of levels of cars are kind of like isotopes. So it's still a Honda Accord, it's just a different level of luxury in essence. So if we look down here at the example, this is 3 different isotopes of carbon. We can have carbon 12, okay, and the 12 here is the mass number. So that means there's 6 protons and 6 neutrons. But if we have carbon 13, okay, we still have to have 6 protons because that's what makes it carbon. But in order to have a mass number of 13, we got to have an extra neutron. So this one has 7 neutrons instead of 6 neutrons. And then we can go even a step further. Carbon 14 is the one I was describing before, where you might have 8 neutrons buddied up with the 6 protons in the nucleus to give you a mass of 14. So again, all carbon atoms, just different levels of luxury or space, if you want to think about it like that. So in chemistry, you also talked about nuclear chemistry or radioisotopes. Radioactive isotopes is what that stands for. So many isotopes of elements are stable. That means their nucleuses remain intact forever. They've got, equal numbers, or at least, appropriate ratios of protons and neutrons. And so there's no, stress there. Everything's good. The nucleus stays intact. However, some isotopes are what we call radioisotopes or radioactive isotopes, in which there is an unstable ratio of protons and neutrons. And so the nucleus wants to start getting rid of some of that to kind of balance it out and make it stable again. So remember, the nucleus is going to give off certain types of particles. Remember, we said we talked about alpha, beta, and gamma particles. And that, might seem kind of bad, which, it can be. Radiation can be harmful to tissues. But a small amount of radiation and using radioisotopes can actually be very helpful in diagnosing certain diseases and disorders. So radioisotopes are often used in research in medicine in order to kind of see what's going on. So on the pictures on the right, we can see radioisotopes are being used to image the brain. So basically the person's usually injected with some radioactive dye that will go through their system, and they'll be put in that big tube thing, like that CT scan thingy, and then that will pick up the radioactive particles that are coming from whatever part of the body is inside that tube. So for example, his head's in the tube, so we get images of his brain. So those are the radioactive particles inside the brain that are showing up in some of those cells. So that can be helpful in diagnosing some certain disorders and diseases when it comes to medicine. If we remember back to chemistry again, we talked a lot about electrons, because the electrons are going to determine how atoms interact with each other. And if you remember, electrons around the nucleus have different levels of energy. The closer they are to the nucleus, the lower the energy, the more at home they feel in essence. And the further away they are from the nucleus, the more agitated they are, the more energy they have. So remember, the electrons in that valence shell out there, the very outermost shell, those are the ones that are going to be involved in interacting with other atoms in order to make compounds. Let's take a look a little more deeply at electrons, since they're so important for atoms coming together as compounds. So remember, electrons are going to orbit the nucleus at specific energy levels. Those are called electron shells. We can have elements that have just one electron shell. We can have elements that have 2, 3, more, up to 7 electron shells. Now each shell holds a specific number of electrons. So remember, shell number 1, the one closest to the nucleus, only holds 2 electrons. Okay? If we go one shell out, shell number 2 can hold 8 electrons, like we see here, 2, 4, 6, 8. If we had a third shell, that could hold up to 18, and etc., etc. Now it's the outermost shell, or that valence shell, that is going to determine whether an atom is reactive or not. So basically, if the outer shell is full, the atom is stable. It's not going to go out and hook up with anybody else to make a compound. However, if that outer shell is not full, the atom becomes very reactive. And so it's going to go and seek out to make a bond with another compound, or with another element, in order to make a compound so that it's nice and stable again. It either, remember, it transfers electrons or it shares electrons so that it's nice and happy again. So this is how atoms come together to form compounds or molecules, through chemical bonds. So remember, Atoms with incomplete outer electrons, that valence shell has an empty spot, those atoms are going to be reactive. If they've got a complete outer shell, they're not. They're not going to be reactive. They're not going to seek out anybody. Remember, those are the noble gases, those guys that have 8 electrons in their outer shell, and they're good to go. They don't need anybody else. They're kind of loners in that sense. Now remember, atoms can either transfer or share electrons in order to achieve stability again, or to become happy. And it's the transferring and the sharing of these outer electrons that results in those, atoms being close enough together to make what's called a chemical bond that will hold them together as compounds. So let's take a look at those 2 different types of chemical bonds that we can have. We'll first investigate the ionic bond. So in an ionic bond, the atoms will transfer outer shell electrons from one atom to another. Now what happens is that, the atoms are originally electrically neutral. So if we take a look at sodium here, sodium has 11 protons in the middle, so he's going to have 11 electrons around it. Now, if we look at his valence shell only has 1, right? So even though he's electrically neutral, he's very kind of unstable, unhappy, because he's got that 1 valence electron instead of a nice full shell of 8. Chlorine, on the other hand, has 17 protons in the middle, so he's got 17 electrons on the outside. If he's a nice, stable, neutral chlorine atom. But again, if we take a look at his valence shell, we've got an empty spot. We only have 7 valence electrons rather than 8. So what happens is that a sodium can go ahead and give away his electron to chlorine. Once sodium gives away his valence electron, the valence shell disappears. If you remember, the valence shell disappears, and now underneath the valence shell, the one right here, is the one that becomes the new valence shell. And look, it is happily stable with 8 electrons. So that makes sodium, kind of very happy in that sense of having a full valence shell. Now, when chlorine gets that extra electron there, again, look, he becomes happy. His valence shell is now full with 8, and we've got a chemical bond here. Now, when these electrons are transferred from one to another, now we've got atoms, though, that are not electrically neutral, right? Sodium lost his valence electron, so now he's got 10 electrons on the outside and 11 protons on the inside. So he's a positive charge because he's got 1 more proton than electron. And remember, when chlorine gets that extra electron, right, he had 17 protons on the inside, and now with that extra electron that he snagged from sodium, he's got 18 electrons on the outside. So now he's got 1 more electron than proton, so that makes him a negative charge. So those atoms, both atoms, are no longer electrically neutral, but they're still happy. In fact, they attract each other. The positive aura of the sodium atom is going to attract the negative aura of the chlorine atom, and they're going to stick together as a compound. So when we have an ionic bond, the atoms are basically kind of completing each other, right? So they're in love, and it's like when they say, "Oh, I love you, you complete me," right? That's what's happening in an ionic bond. They are fulfilling each other's valence shell dream of having 8. So when sodium atoms, or any metal atom is going to lose the electrons. So when any metal atom loses, he becomes that positive charge, and that's called a cation. Remember that? Now, if it's a non-metal and you gain, so this is metal, remember, non-metals gain. So any non-metal that gains an electron becomes a negative charge, and that's what we call an anion. So we want to make sure that we have those 2 definitions wired there. So cations are positive and anions are negative. So like I'd mentioned before, because the metal atom is a positive charge and the non-metal atom is a negative charge, there's an attraction there. Opposites attract in chemistry. So positive charges will attract negative charges, and they're going to hold each other together to make what's called an ionic bond. So there's going to be attractive force there, and we call that attractive force an ionic bond because we've got one atom, the metal atom, giving away its electron, become a positive charge, and the non-metal atom getting, an electron in order to fill its valence shell to become a negative charge. So the positives and the negatives attract and make an ionic bond. Let's take a look at the second type of bond, which, if you remember, they're called covalent bonds. And in covalent bonds, we have a sharing of outer electrons. So instead of giving away an electron or taking an electron to become positive or negative charge and being held together by an electrostatic force, what happens is that two or more atoms share one or more outer valence electrons, and they're held together by what's called this covalent bond. Now, the term molecules is specifically related to compounds that are formed by covalent bonds. So anything that has a covalent bond is called a molecule. Usually, if it's an ionic bond, we call it a compound. So there is a slight difference between those two words. Now, the number of covalent bonds an atom can form, remember, is going to be equal to the number of electrons it needs in order to fill up its valence shell. So if the valence shell just needs one more, okay, in order to be happy, have that full state, whether it's 2 on the first ring or 8 on the second shell, it's going to make as many bonds as it needs to fill up the shell. So if there's one valence electron and it needs just one more to make a full valence shell, then we'll only make one covalent bond. If we take a look at the examples down here, we can see that hydrogen has one shell. So remember, the first shell holds 2 electrons. Okay, so hydrogen has 1 electron, so it can share its electron with another hydrogen and form one covalent bond. So they're sharing 2 electrons to form one covalent bond. Now if we take a look at oxygen, though, oxygen has 2 vacancies in its valence shell. So it needs to make 2 bonds. And so if we take a look here, it's going to share 2 electrons with each other to make what we call a double bond. So atoms can share more than one pair of electrons if need be. In fact, they can share up to 3 pairs of electrons to make what's called a triple bond. But anything more than that is going to be way too unstable and hard for them to do. So covalent bonds, there can be single bonds, which is 1 pair of electrons being shared, double bond, which is 2 pairs of electrons, and triple bonds, which are 3 pairs of electrons. When we're talking about chemistry and biology, we're going to be mainly talking on the cellular level. So cells are constantly rearranging the molecules inside, making new proteins, breaking down sugars. For energy, all kinds of different chemical reactions occur. And chemical reactions are basically it's just a term for breaking apart existing chemical bonds and forming new ones. So that's what a chemical reaction is. You're breaking apart one type of molecule or compound, and you're forming a new type of molecule or compound. So remember, we've got reactants on the left-hand side, reactants, and that's what you start with, and then we've got products on the right-hand side. So in a chemical reaction, remember, conservation of matter says we cannot create or destroy, so we have to have the same number of atoms in the chemical reaction. They're just going to be arranged differently. So if we take a look at this chemical reaction here, we've got 2 molecules of hydrogen gas, so that's 4 atoms of hydrogen reacting with 1 molecule of oxygen gas, or 2 atoms of oxygen gas, and it's going to make water, right? 2 molecules of water. If we take a look and we count them up, we have 4 hydrogens, just like we had over here on the left, and we have 2 oxygens, just like we had again on the left. So we have the same number of atoms, they're just arranged differently in this chemical reaction. Let's talk about a substance that no living thing can live without, and that's water. Remember, water is H2O. So we have 2 hydrogen atoms covalently bonded to 1 oxygen atom. Now, if you remember from general chemistry, water is what we call a polar substance. That means those electrons are not shared fairly. So yes, the hydrogen oxygens are sharing electrons, but those electrons spend more time around one atom than they do around the other. And in fact, because oxygen has many more protons than hydrogen, it's got more pulling strength, right? Because the electrons are negative and the protons are positive. If you've got many more protons pulling, okay, or attracting those electrons are going to spend much more time around oxygen than they do hydrogen. And so that makes what we call a polar bond, where the oxygen atom becomes slightly negative in charge because the extra electrons are spending more time around it, and those poor hydrogen atoms, they become positive charges because those electrons don't spend too much time around them. So there's the one proton in hydrogen's kind of sitting there lonely by himself. Although that seems really unfair, it's actually super important that water is the way that it is, because this allows an oxygen of one water molecule to become weakly attracted to the positive of another hydrogen in another water molecule, and we get this stickiness of water. So if we take a look, here is the red is the oxygen, and we've got that slightly negative, and that's going to be attracted to the hydrogen of another water molecule. So it's going to make a little attraction there. Now, it's not a bond because they're not sharing electrons or anything. So hydrogen bond is a very misleading name for it. It's just an attraction, okay? But it's an important attraction because it gives water its cohesive and adhesive properties that make it a great solvent for life. So meaning that water can, basically dissolve a whole bunch of different kinds of stuff, which is super important. So again, this stickiness, this hydrogen bonding, the weak attraction between water molecules is what makes it what we call cohesive. It sticks to each other. And that's super important, especially for super tall trees. I don't know if anybody has visited the redwoods, but they, can grow up to like 300 plus feet in the air. It's amazing. But it's like, how does it live, way up there? Well, it's because water is cohesive. Those water molecules can stick together, and they can basically kind of crawl up the veins of the tree, in essence, in order to feed those the leaves way up on the top. Okay, and then other animals, like the water beetle here, actually uses that property of water in order to survive and walk on water. Because water has a high surface tension. It's not easily broken. So the bonds, the attractions between the water molecules are not easily broken because it's so sticky with hydrogen bonding that a lot of different kinds of bugs use that in order, for survival. They can scamper across water to get away from predators, while those predators would just easily, their body weight would break the surface tension and they'd sink right in. Another thing that hydrogen bonding does to water is that it helps it regulate its temperature. So compared to other substances, water resists temperature heating and cooling much easier than other substances. So if and that's because of the hydrogen bonding. So y'all have been to the beach, or at least I hope y'all have been to the beach because we live in California. So you notice that, okay, so when you get there, it might be 80 something degrees outside. So the air temperature is 80 something degrees. The sand is usually a lot hotter, all right? And then you jump into the water and it's freaking cold, all right? And that's because, and it's such a drastic difference due to this hydrogen bonding. So when the sun is heating up the different substances that make up the environment, okay, sand, okay, doesn't resist any heat temperature. It just takes the heat and warms right up, okay? The air around you is going to do the same thing. It's, you know, it's going to take very little heat to kind of warm it up. But water is going to take a lot more heat to heat it up, because water has those sticky hydrogen bond attractions that have to break first before the molecules can move fast enough to increase the temperature. Okay, same thing with cooling. It's gotta, you know, it's gotta reform those hydrogen bonds, so it's going to cool down a lot slower as well. Hydrogen bonding is also important when we take water from a liquid phase and we bring it down to a solid phase. So when water freezes, it's got really rigid hydrogen bonds that keep the water molecules at a greater distance than in liquid. So what happens is that ice water, has a unique property of being less dense than the liquid water, that makes it up. So ice floats. And that's super important when we're talking and looking at ecosystems of lakes in, Alaska, Canada, northern, anywhere, near the polar regions where it gets really cold. If ice were to sink when it freezes, it would kill animal life and plant life on the bottoms of, oceans and lakes and rivers and streams, anything that will freeze up in the wintertime. So it is awesome that ice, because of the hydrogen bonds, will become less dense than the liquid, so that the ice floats nicely on top, okay, and it'll still allow life to go on underneath it. Like I mentioned earlier, water is the solvent of life. Many, many, many different substances are able to dissolve in water and become an aqueous solution. In fact, water is very easily dissolves ionic substances. Remember, ionic substances are made up of positive ions and negative ions. So because water is polar, the negative the negative oxygen atoms in a water molecule can easily attract the positive ions in an ionic solution and pull it apart from the negative ions. And the negative ions will be attracted to the positive hydrogen atoms, and so they'll kind of hold those ions in solution. And remember just the two kind of keywords here. Solvent is anything that does the dissolving, and a solute is one that's being dissolved. The last chemical concept that we're going to bring back from chemistry that's important for biological life is pH. pH measures the acidity or basicity of a solution. And remember, an acid is any substance that adds more hydrogen ions to the solution. So if it gives away an H plus as it breaks apart, it's going to be an acid. And a base is a chemical compound that accepts hydrogen ions and kind of removes them from the solution. So what we get is hydroxide ions left over. And those hydroxide ions are what we call basic. So acids are going to basically leave the solution with more hydrogen ions, and bases are going to leave the solution with more hydroxide ions. pH is the measurement of how many hydrogen ions are present in the solution. And the pH scale goes from 0, which is the most acidic, right, to 14, which is the most basic. And so the most acidic is going to have high hydrogen ion content, and if you're basic, you've got very little hydrogen ions and you've got more hydroxide ions. Now we have to remember that as we go, up or down the pH scale, each increment is actually a 10-fold change in hydrogen ions. So if we go from unit 7 down to 6, that means pH 6 has 10 times more hydrogen ions than pH 7. But if we compare 7 to 5, 10 times 10 is 100. Okay, so we've got 100 times more hydrogen ions at pH 5 than at pH 7, so on and so forth. So it's, it's not one time change, it's a 10 times change. And remember, when we've got pH of 7, that's neutral, and so that means there's an equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions in the solution. And looks like human blood is close to being neutral, which is awesome. It's actually about 7.4 in pH. So we are kind of, we're on the neutral side. We're not purely, acidic or basic. Although some of our parts can be really acidic. For example, the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, the gastric juices, okay, can be of pH level 2, which is very, very acidic. So our bodies have ways in order to regulate pH and to protect cells from acids and bases, that our body makes in chemical reactions. Like I said before, our body is usually around pH neutral, pH actually of 7.4. So if we have any deviation from that, it's going to cause some harm to your cells. Because remember, going from a pH 7.4 to even 8.4 would be a 10-fold increase in the number of hydrogen ions, which could do some damage. Luckily, our cells have what are called buffers, which are substances that can resist changes in pH. And the way that it does that is that it's able to either accept or donate hydrogen ions. So if there's too many hydrogen ions around in the solution, these buffers will gobble them up so that they don't hurt the cells. Okay? If there's not enough, if it's too basic and there's too much hydroxide ions, the OHs around, what those buffers do is that they spit out hydrogen ions to neutralize the hydroxide ions to make water. So these buffers are super important for cells in order to regulate the pH so that they don't die, which is a good thing. So that is all that we're going to cover here in this lecture of the chemistry that's important to biology. So we will see you next time.